So I am April from the Love and Loss Project, and the Love and Loss Project is an online comfort and inspiration station for women who have experienced the loss of a child, baby, or pregnancy. And I am so grateful today because Shawna Percy has taken time out of her busy life to come and join us here, and has bared with me through the frustration of my technological challenges to make this talk happen. So thank you so much. And I just want to let people know truly what a treat this is, because Shawna Percy is also known as the Good Grief Guru. And she is the creator of all kinds of really amazing and fabulous things. She is the author of this book, Breathe, which I really recommend. And just do this here. Yay, we have our matching copy. And I was fortunate enough to get a signed copy from Shawna, so and Breathe, it says here, is a true story about marriage, faith, and attempted suicide. And Shawna is known not just for this book, but also for her blog, thegoodgriefguru.com, and the work that she does with shawnapercy.com, where she is known throughout the community as being, I would say, a really key leader in breaking some of the silence around taboo topics like loss and suicide and surviving tragedies. And so it really is truly such a pleasure to have you coming into this space.
Thank you. Thank you. Such an honor to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad that you are. So as I've gone through this book, and you can tell I have a few of my little sticky tabs in here, because there's a few pieces that you mentioned in this book that, I mean, so many pieces, but I think that there's a few pieces here that are so powerful and so poignant for people who are working on navigating their way out of the darkness of grief. And so I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about some of the thoughts that you've raised in here. And one of them that really has stood out to me is the idea of the vulnerability of grief and loss and tragedy in our lives. And at one point in your book, you mentioned a metaphor around the idea of experiencing loss and grief is kind of like having the mirror of your identity shattered. And I was just going to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I heard a woman once talk about that at the first bereavement group that I ever went to. Actually, she said that it was like she had seen herself in a mirror one day, and then when her husband died, it was like that mirror shattered on the ground, and she tried looking at herself in the mirror and all of the shattered pieces, and it was so reflective of what her identity crisis had become, what her grief journey had become, because she could no longer recognize herself the way that she was. She had been altered. And I look at that, and I don't want to stop there though, because one of the things that I think is so beautiful is the analogy of the stained glass window. So we could be looking at this shattered mirror on the ground and going, you know, I'm fragmented now. How am I ever going to get put back together again? And yet, if you think about the analogy of a stained glass window, all it is shards of broken glass that have been rearranged and put back together to become this beautiful masterpiece. Wow. And that's what I've seen come out of my grief journey. I've certainly had the identity crisis, had these moments where I don't even recognize myself, and I don't think that I can ever go back to who I was, but that's okay, because I'm moving forward into something new, into some new creation, some new masterpiece. So I welcome that.
I love that idea of the stained glass window. I mean, I've never heard it put that way, and that truly is such a beautiful way to describe it. I often talk about that grief really forces us to come to this crossroads in our life where we are going to be changed, because these are changing experiences. And so I think it's so neat when you talk about that idea of that stained glass window, that, yeah, there's going to be some differences happen here, and things are going to look and feel different, but it can still be something amazing and something good at the end of it.
Yes, absolutely. The other thing I love about that analogy is stained glass windows are so colorful. And if I look back on who I was and how I typically saw life before reaching traumatic grief, I saw things in a very black and white worldview. But then when grief happened and I was propelled into this world where I wasn't going to have all of the answers for everything and there couldn't be absolutes for everything anymore. In that world, I discovered there's a whole lot of color in between black and white. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with not having answers to everything anymore. And it can actually be quite freeing being in the unknown. Scary at first, really, really scary, but then freeing. Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's the terrifying part that we're all kind of touching on, right? When you're talking about loss, because our world really does change in an instant.
Yes.
And I very much have experienced that for my own self after the loss of my daughter, where it really in an instant, my whole world had changed. Things that I felt I really knew for sure, I didn't have those places anymore to be able to put my feet down. Yeah, and I love the idea that you mentioned and kind of talk about in your book about the idea that we have such a goal attainment kind of culture, and we have such a striving and accomplishment and sense of mastery and competence trajectory that we all kind of aim for. And for me, there was something really humbling about the idea of loss and grief, and your way of describing just that process of goal attainment and how that kind of connects to the idea of survival and getting through in some ways really resonated with me in the sense that, or what it got me thinking when I read that, is making sense of my own piece of feeling very humbled and my own piece of almost feeling like a failure in this way that I couldn't quite explain, because even though I had some guilt over the idea of all of that coulda, woulda, shoulda, right? What could I have done differently that we all grasp at? I think inevitably when we go through loss, there was also just this kind of like humbled piece of almost feeling like failure in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that piece a little bit, or how that applies for your experience.
Yeah, I think especially because suicide is involved in my story. It was my first husband had died by suicide, as you know, and I've also struggled with my own suicidal ideation when I'm what I call trauma triggered. So I have things that trigger me, and when that happens, I just kind of, where is the off switch? And I've since come to understand that as I tap into a reservoir of resources and build up my supports, that thought becomes more of a distant idea, and these other supports become the highlighted ones. But so when it comes to, if the goal was for me to have saved my husband's life, the woulda, shoulda, coulda, I guess in a way I was very privileged, because one of the first things that a police officer said to me is, don't start asking why. It's such a slippery slope. And I really listened to him, except for one day I started and I saw it was so scary how I could go down that slope, how quickly that could happen. And it jolted me out of there, and I went, oh, that's why he said don't go there, because we can't change our loved ones' stories. All we can do is use them to help other people, and I found life in that. So there has been life that's come out of this death. The other thing is that I think when it comes to suicide loss, and I'm sure with other losses as well, guilt can be a significant factor in those types of death. And I often say that I was privileged to have spent part of my childhood with somebody who was a guilt tripper. And the reason I say that was because I learned early on how unproductive guilt can be.
Yeah.
And so before I experienced this traumatic loss, I had kind of dug my heels in and just said, I'm not going there. There's lots of other really dark, ugly places that I'll end up being on this journey, but I'm not going to go there. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've been able to do what I'm doing, because it is very destructive.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. And I think that's such an important part, because I think in some way there's inevitably that either why, which is close to the idea of why me, that inevitably creeps in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think that we sometimes forget, because it can happen so fast and feel so strong, that there is still a choice there in how long we let ourselves stay with that question. And I agree wholeheartedly that if we stay with that question, that is really when we get pulled into some really dark places.
Yeah.
It's really hard to get back out.
Yes.
How were you able to make that shift and turn that question off a little bit when it did come up for you?
I've been an observer most of my life. So whether it's observing other people or myself, I really pay attention to how I'm responding to something. And one of the things that I learned when Neil had attempted suicide, one of the things that came out of that is I realized that there is good and bad in everything, but how resilient I am depends totally on which side I choose to focus on. I think it's really important to acknowledge the bad. We need to face it, we need to address it, but not to live there. Right. If I want to live, I need to embrace the good. So to be able to carry that perception then into my grief journey was so valuable. And when I went down that road of starting to ask the question why, I could feel that feeling of this is pulling me under. Yeah. So I observed that, and it's like, no, I need life. I need to grab onto life. Yeah. And so, yeah, it was the bad side, and that's no place to live.
That's right. And what you're kind of touching on in that is really making a decision to get through it. That idea.
It is.
A decision to get back to the light and out of the darkness.
Yes, yeah. When Neil died, I didn't know it was suicide at first. I didn't actually get the coroner's report until 10 months later. So I knew that it was likely, but it wasn't confirmed. So the first bereavement group I went to was a group for individuals who had lost a spouse who still had dependents living at home, very specific group. And when I went there, they made us wait until our second week to share our story. And I actually had to wait until the third week because there were so many people. And it was torture waiting to let go of pieces of this story, because I think there's something that was inside of all of us that knew that we just needed to talk. That was part of our healing process. And when we started to talk, it was very hard to then make us be quiet again. And then after I learned that it was suicide, I went to a suicide bereavement group. And before I went, I had started the Good Grief Guru blog, and I had been talking openly about my grief journey and then about how I was processing learning that he had died by suicide. So I had been talking about that stigmatized piece. But when I went to this suicide bereavement group, even though everyone in that room had lost someone to suicide, most of the people in that room had not shared that with other people. There were individuals in that room whose loved one had passed away a decade ago, and they had never told anyone that it was suicide. And even in that room, it was so difficult for people to let go of a piece of their story. But when they did, it was like you could see this physical weight being lifted off their shoulders. And I walked out of that group that first night and I went, wow, that's why it was so important for me to be sharing my story with other people. So one of my goals is that as I share, I'm hoping it's going to make it easier for other people to know that they can share too. And there's spaces for that to happen where it's safe. And I'm hoping that their healing will come through that as well.
Yeah, I think that's amazing and incredibly powerful. And for me, that's really one of the reasons why I wanted to start having conversations like these ones, because I really am passionate about the idea that we live in a culture where we don't really talk about things like death and loss and suicide. And so in some ways it becomes this kind of taboo topic that leaves people feeling really alone at times. And
Yeah,
so I really want to be a part of literally having more dialogue and more conversation about this kind of stuff. So you had mentioned the idea that for you at one point in time, there was that idea of looking a little bit at the differences between people who, and I know that this was in a bit of a different context when you had shared this idea, but looking at the idea of being transparent with being vulnerable and letting people know essentially that you were open to assistance and to support. Can you share that idea and how that relates?
Yeah, absolutely. When Neil had first attempted suicide, we were living in London, Ontario. And so I was new to London. I didn't know a lot of people there. And then this crisis happened. We were going to a church in London, and I decided it's just my personality. It's not everybody's personality, but I'm a very open individual. So I started talking to people about what had happened and what I needed or what I was struggling with. And I saw people step up to that. Wow. At the same time, there was a couple going to that same church who were friends of ours. And we get together, and they were really struggling because they were going through some stuff, but people weren't reaching out to them. And I, again, the observer, I looked at the situation and I thought, well, why am I getting the response I'm getting and they're not? What's the difference? And the difference that I saw was I was helping people know how to help me. Yeah. Because we don't tend to be the type of society that pries into other people's business unless they're of celebrity status. So we often ask the question, how are you? And people answer fine. Yeah. It can be the furthest thing from the truth, but that's typically how people will answer. And if somebody says fine, people don't normally say, are you sure? Because I'm not sensing that. Could you maybe tell me what's going on? So I think that we need to be coming at this from two angles. One is, as the individual who needs help, I can do so much to help others know how to come alongside me. Yeah. And then as the individual who wants to help, I can also perhaps help that conversation become easier by trying to ask, maybe by politely prying a little bit, and then see if the door's open for a further conversation. One of the people I'm really passionate about is Dr. Patch Adams. And so he started a healthcare institute in the United States called the Gesundheit Institute. And if I'm correct, I believe that their doctors don't even have liability insurance, because what he realized was that put all of the pressure, all of the onus on the doctor to fix people. But in the Gesundheit Institute, individuals who come there, the patients who come there for healing, they have to take a responsibility to engage in their own healing process. And so we're seeing this happen from both sides. Yeah. And I think it's a much more holistic approach and fulfilling approach to a healing journey.
And I think that also touches on the idea that it really is a two-way street, and that we have a really important role to play in getting what we need. Because I think a lot of us tend to work under the assumption that if somebody just loves us enough, or if they're a good enough person, they'll know what I need right now, and they'll step up and do that. And
Yeah.
from my own experience, my needs really changed by the day. So it might have been one day where I didn't want to talk to anybody, and I didn't want to talk about anything more serious than the weather, right? And then I might have really been craving to be able to talk a little bit more about my daughter and my story. And so
Yes.
that was really such a moving landscape, that to just kind of say, well, if other people are doing this right, or if they're a good enough friend, or if they're good enough family, they'll be able to read my mind here, right? Is really what it means. And so I think there's just that neat piece of kind of giving yourself room that you want whatever you want, and that's okay, whether that's space, connection, or whatever that is, but that you are the gatekeeper for that needs to give connection to the people around you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's so true. I have a friend actually who right now is facing someone whose loss is likely coming very soon. And as an individual who's gone through a grief journey, sometimes people expect that I would know how to respond, but I don't. I know how to respond in ways that I understand, but not necessarily in ways that someone else might understand. And so this individual actually had to take me aside and said, I know that you're doing lots of doing for me, but I need you to just sit here and hold my hand for a bit. And so they really needed physical touch, whereas I was trying to help them by doing the dishes and cleaning up for them, but that wasn't reaching them the way that they needed. So it was so helpful for me to hear that, because of course I wanted to meet them in a way that was meaningful for them.
Yeah, and that's so brave in some ways for her to speak up and ask for exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But at the same time, that bravery gave you the opportunity to give her what she needs.
Yes, exactly.
Which is what really most people really are a bit desperate for in our circles, right? They want to be helpful. And we do have such a, the famous line, right, is I don't know what to say, or let me know if you need, right? Because we all kind of get lost in what do you do and what do you say? And I think that pressure to do and say all the right things often can create a bit of paralysis, right? And that people don't do the wrong thing. And so they may decide of taking a step back and saying nothing at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I really believe that in general, people are good intentioned. And so it's not a matter of whether they're well-meaning for the most part. I think it's more so, are we helping them, and are they helping us also perhaps open up?
That's right. With that point that we all have individual differences, right? And so my story and what might have been helpful for me might look like this, but for someone else, they really might have a very different need that they're craving.
Yeah. And you touched on something earlier too, when you said that your needs can change based on the day, which is also why I think it's important to have a reservoir of resources that we can tap into. And there might be those friends who we know they're really good to have a cup of coffee with or have a conversation, and someone else is really good to have a good cry with. And so are we going to the individuals who are perhaps more likely to meet our needs? And I know there's this concept sometimes that family and friends who really love us are the ones who are there for us when we're in our time of need. But I also think that perhaps we're not able to be everything to all people at all times. Maybe that's too much pressure. So it's good for us to know who can be that one thing that we're looking for at this time, because it's what we need, and then tap into that resource.
That's right, because I think that is, and it's funny because as part of my work, I also work with couples. And that's kind of one idea that we have to kind of work through a little bit, is that the idea that if my partner loves me, they're somehow going to be able to be my very best friend, my closest companion, my team for the chores we need to do, the best co-parent, the person I have the most fun with, that they really need to be hitting all of these points all of the time, which are needs that back in the day used to be met by a whole wide community, but are smaller and smaller and smaller, and so more and more pressure on the select few that we can our families and circles and communities have shrunk, right?
Yeah, it's so true.
That's so neat. So Shawna, I'm just curious if you could share any tips or any words that you think can help people who've experienced loss and who are in that dark place right now. What would you want them to know?
Two things. Sorry, what was that last part?
Oh, that's okay. So for people who are in that dark place right now and who are maybe getting some of that why now kind of questions and all of that stuff, what would you want them to know?
I would say focus on how whatever you're tapping into is affecting you. So if you start asking yourself those why questions, is that helpful or is that harmful? If it's helpful, pursue it. If it's harmful, why? If it's not life-giving, why pursue it? I think maybe that's the perhaps only appropriate why question that I can think of. And yet the other ones are so tempting. And I'd say that with anything. I know, to be perfectly honest, at the beginning of my grief journey, I was drinking a lot. That was part of how I was coping with things. But I reached this day where I realized that, you know what, this is bringing a lot more harm to me than it is helping me. So why am I doing this? This isn't giving me life. The other thing is that you had just said, what would you say to the individuals who are in a dark place? Going back to the idea of analogy and how powerful it can be, and with my background, having a faith-based background, there's so much powerful analogy that comes out of the darkness. So, for example, all of creation is born out of the darkness. When we think about newborn babies, they are living in darkness for 9 months, and it's in that darkness that they're growing. That's where so much growth is happening, but there's no light in there. And then all of a sudden, one day, they're just born into this new world. So even though it can feel like it's this dark place and it's void and it's empty and there's nothing there, there's actually so much life there. Sometimes we just can't see it until we've come out into this new world, though. I know, looking back on when I was in the darkest of dark places, for whatever reason, I was able to write better then than I ever could before or after. And I was able to process things in ways that I haven't been able to since. So it seemed to have triggered things in my mind and in my ability that I'm just not able to go, oh, well, now I'd really like to write like that. So there's something that's growing in you in that dark place. And if you can find it, grab hold of it, because it's rich and it can enrich you. The last thing I'd say is you're not alone. I know that so many of the journeys that we take in life can feel isolating. But if I can paint a picture for a moment, and I think that it ties in with baby loss really well as well, because I suspect that if I was to ask this question, I would see the same kind of response. But this past Sunday, I was speaking at a church in Waterloo, and there were hundreds of people there. And near the beginning of my talk, I asked everyone to stand up. And then I proceeded to ask the following question. And I said, if you know somebody who's died of suicide, if you or someone you know has had thoughts of suicide or attempted suicide, please remain standing and everyone else can sit down. And out of hundreds of people, only 2 people in that room sat down. And the way that that then impacted people to look around, people who thought, this is just me. It's just me struggling with this, or it's just me who knows somebody who's died by suicide. They walked out of that room knowing that it is not just them. And part of that is so hopeful because now they have community and they know that there's hundreds of people they can talk to about this. And the other side, of course, is heartbreaking to know that suicide has touched so many lives. And I really suspect if I was to ask the question of, you know, have you experienced child loss, baby loss, or the loss of a pregnancy to a room full of women, how many of those women would be left standing? I suspect the numbers would be a lot higher than we know just from surface talk. So we have a lot of comfort and healing that we can bring to one another through story sharing, just sharing our lives together and being transparent.
And what that just makes me think of as you say that is that place of the darkness is where we all spend some time in some form at some point of our lives. And that just touches on that idea of this vulnerability stuff, right? The kind of imperfection stuff, the stuff that hurts, the painful stuff. All of that is the real, right? That all of that is the stuff that that we need to bring forward in order to connect with people as our whole living selves.
Yeah, that's right. And if you think about cultures who, like right now, our days are fairly even, that we have a lot of light and then we have darkness so that we can have a good night's sleep. There's actually rest that can be had in the darkness. But there's some cultures that throughout certain times of the year, they have light almost for 24 hours a day. And the way that that affects them psychologically in a negative way, just think about that for a moment, that actually too much light can be harmful. So I think too much light or too much darkness, both of them can be harmful, but to have the balance and see the value in both can be so beneficial.
Yes, I love that so much. That's so powerful, Shawna. Thank you. For taking.
You're welcome.
I'd love to do this again because I feel like there's so much to just talk about for hours and hours. And you have so much that I think is really valuable and really important for people to hear. So
thank you. It's mutual. I feel the same towards you.
Thank you so much, Shawna. All right. Thank you, everyone who came by. And this recording will be available. Check out Shawna's blog. You'll be able to find a recording there as well, which is shawnapercy.com. This is her book, Breathe, which is powerful and lovely and a great tool to also help you find your way out of your own darkness. So thank you so much, Shawna, for coming by. All right. Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye.